Building a startup from scratch is tough. My name is Justin McLeod, and I'm your host for a new podcast series called Back to the Basics. In this show, I'll be talking to startup experts as they discuss the fundamentals of launching and running your first tech startup.
In the tech world or in the venture world, it's like, oh, lifestyle businesses, we would never fund those. But it's kind of like people really are out here building some pretty successful lifestyle businesses. You have to think about, like, what are you building and what do you need to get to where you ultimately want to go?
The difference between a lifestyle business and a venture-backed startup is speed and profitability. My next guest, Sevetri Wilson, had the pleasure of building both. A profitable service-based business that transformed into an $8 million venture-backed startup. Sevetri will share her story of transitioning from bootstrapped to venture-backed, lessons learned as a first-time founder, and breaking status quos as a Black, non-technical, female founder based in the South. Enjoy the show.
I do feel like entrepreneurship is in my blood. My father owned a cement company. Coming up, he passed away when I was really young, but he owned a cement company. So I always feel like, I have like the business mindset of my father, and hopefully the heart of my mother. I always say that. But yeah, I do feel like it's kind of in my blood. And then as I kind of started matriculating through college, I started thinking about like ideas I could bring to fruition. Not so much thinking about like, oh, I can make money, but the entrepreneurial sense is like, oh, I could build something, I could create something, I could launch something.
Right. That's awesome. And then so what you created was solid ground innovation. So tell us a little bit about like what made you, spark that idea. Like, was it something in college that you saw, or is it something that you were, was it your major? You like, hey, I can do this for other people. What sparked you to, start Solid Ground Innovations?
Yeah. So actually, when I was in college, I would say my first company was called this online newspaper. It was called Be Now. And I was essentially bringing students from LSU and Southern University together to like write. I didn't really think it was a business then, but I guess in today's world, it would be considered like my first entrepreneurial experience. But after that, I actually thought that I was going to go the academia route. And had, went on to get like a master's and thought I was going to be a professor and I was going to be like my history professor and like basically educate people about, the things they don't teach you in history books, right? And use my journalism degree to bring forward some type of filming or documentary piece to that. And obviously the world had other plans. And really the way how I built Solid Ground was that I was working for a nonprofit called CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocates for Children who've been in and out of foster care. And I was helping them as a stakeholder and an advocate at the state capitol, so advocating for foster children's rights. And people started reaching out to me essentially because they liked the program design, the curriculum that I was creating for CASA. And I went to LSU. And so, LSU was definitely a huge sports school. And so some of like the boosters and others who had worked with like athletes who had gone on to play professional sports or to the Olympics. So I worked with like Lolo Jones and Tyrus Thomas and Brandon Bass, like those guys when they were coming out of LSU. And I was helping them essentially with their community efforts with their foundations. And so in doing that, that's how I actually started Solid Ground Innovations as a consultancy management service firm, specifically helping nonprofits early on. And then as that company began to grow, I actually was like, I don't want to work with athletes anymore because they just too much trouble. It's a lot. And it's funny because I've come full circle because we just signed the contract with the NBA PA. So where you start, never think that you may not come back that way at some point in time.
Full circle.
But I had written off athletes and I moved on to like working for corporations, working for other non-traditional nonprofits, for private foundations. And that's how Solid Ground got off the ground through those type of contracts. We began to essentially expand into more of a services agency, branching out, not just serving nonprofits, but also corporations. I ran communications for first female mayor of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So I was doing everything, right? The entire gambit SGI did.
And what is 22 years old when you were doing this? Or
yeah, when I first started at SGI, I was 22, not knowing what I was doing.
excellent. Okay, well that's one great start to entrepreneurship right there. So in regards to like getting like your first, contracts, proposals, and then really getting that first, million, like, seeing that first, 7 figures in the bank account, or just like generated just throughout the year. Like how did that make you feel? And then two, just like, what did it take in regards to like operational wise to like, get to that first, million, or those first few hundred, couple of customers?
Yeah, it took me 5 years to make my first million at SGI, and it took me 8 months to do it in Resilia. And so definitely you learn a lot along the way. Just keep going.
It's a process.
You learn a lot. If you have the ability to fail, like learn from your failures, and have the just like the desire to keep going, I think that you eventually start to get it right, or you will be like, all right, I got to do something else, or make a move and do something different. Or what I'm doing isn't working right. But my first million with SGI, we started really small, right? And so I remember some of our earliest contracts, man, you probably couldn't bring me up today for like some of those size of those contracts, but we were just trying to get like our footing on the ground. And so we were just trying to prove ourselves, right? So we just needed those first customers to like validate like what we were doing, to serve as referrals. And it worked, right? And so we started getting referrals. And for me, I didn't have a network. At this point, both of my parents were deceased. So my mother had passed away. My father had passed away when I was younger. And I didn't come from, like, nobody knew a name that everybody knew. Nobody knew me coming out of college or anything. And so I started with just reaching out to politicians, right? And so reaching out to politicians and asking to like meet them and network with them. And so the interesting thing about politicians is that they know everybody, right? So they know the business people, they know who has money because they always fundraising, they know the doctors, they know the lawyers, they know everybody. And so I began to tell them like what I was doing, and they were like, oh, well, let me introduce you to such and such. They may be need of something, of some services. And so I started building my company like contract by contract, brought on my first team member, then brought on the second team member. We started building, so truly bootstrapping, like reinvesting all of our contracts. And then I went to Black Enterprise Conference, Entrepreneur Summit in Ohio, like years ago. And I was sitting and listening to a woman, Nicole Parker. She's based in Atlanta. And she was talking about government contracting. And I had never heard about government contracting at this, where it felt like I could actually do it, right? I can see that it's attainable for me. And she explained it in such a way that I was like, oh, I'm leaving money on the table. Somebody gets stuff out of your mind as a business owner. And I started to navigate the government contracting space. And that got me into doing work with locally with cities, then doing state work contracts, then doing federal contracts. And by way of government contracting, it exposed me to doing larger contracts with private companies. And so one of my first 7-figure contracts was with Aetna Better Health. And we essentially did all of their Medicaid advertising when they were coming, when their Medicaid program came to Louisiana. And so that contract is what like catapulted my company to the next level.
That is amazing, because I think, I was running the pre-accelerator program at Atlanta Tech Village, and, we talk about like, the program has generated, 2.5 million in revenue. Half of that 2.5 was from one startup lady, and she got a government contract that was like worth like $1.2 million. So a lot of people are sleeping on like the amount of money that's the government has in regards to like, businesses. So that's awesome. So I guess transitioning. So from, bootstrapping your business, from, having like more so consultancy within the nonprofit space and government contracts, and pivoting to a product that's like, more scalable. Like, what was that process? Like, what was that aha moment where you was like, okay, I have services, but I want to create a product of the same thing I'm doing, but just kind of streamline. What was that product to shift to the tech world, to startup world?
My business buddies are like, are you crazy? Like, why you want to go do that? Like, your business is like doing well. Like, you could just continue to build like your your agency. And I was like, nah, we gotta do something bigger than this. I always felt like SGI it was never gonna be like scalable. It was gonna be like comfortable, right? I think it would have provided like me a comfortable life. And I was like, nah, I gotta do something destructive. Like, I felt like, my legacy was gonna be bigger than just, running behind athletes, or bigger than doing things like local. I felt that I need to have like a bigger impact, and one that essentially could reach more people, right? And so I started thinking about how we could productize our services. And at the time, we were being disrupted, right, in advertising by all this technology and people going digital. And so I was like, man, we either are going to be disruptors in our space with the customers that we're working with, then nonprofits and like grantors, those who are like deploying capital, or something's going to come along, right? So the Blackbaud's of the world had been around for like 20 something years, and they were just like old clunky pieces of software, but that's all people had, so they used them. And so I started thinking about how we could begin to productize our professional services and deliver through a software solution. And that gave rise to originally Exempt Me Now. And essentially we were turbo-taxing the process of incorporation and exemption for nonprofits. But then as those customers began to mature on our platform, they started asking for other services. And so we continue to think about how we could essentially begin to productize our consultancy services even more and deliver through a subscription, which began to morph us into a SaaS business model. And so we had previously worked as a consultant for grantees, so nonprofits, as well as grantors, so private foundations, cities who deployed money, corporations who were giving money, funds, family foundations. And so we started creating products for them as well. And so now Resilia has 3 products in market. One is the formation if you're starting a new nonprofit. One is for existing organizations. And then the third is for those who deploy capital, which now during COVID has been, we've seen an uptick in business because of like COVID-19 funds, because of Black Lives Matter funds, people dedicating money for systemic racism, equity. And so, yeah, definitely have seen the tides change a lot faster for us than we thought was going to happen with our product on that end.
So with the with that change, like what was the biggest difference from running like a service-based business to like, being in the tech world? Like, was it like a culture shock? Like not just just the different styles of businesses or different mentalities, but just also, being a woman in tech, being an African-American woman in tech as well. Like what were those, I guess, those two
changes,
that transition.
Yeah. So my friend Sherelle always, like, she called me in one of her articles. She's like, oh, Sevetri's like the antithesis, right? She's from the South. She's a solo founder. She's non-technical. She's African-American. She's a woman. She's basically everything they say you're not supposed to be as a tech founder, right? I'm like the opposite. Right. They say you can't make it if you're non-technical. You can't make it if you're a solo founder, right? These are all the things that they've told us for like all these years. And I was like, I'm gonna try it anyway. You got to defeat me first. Right. And if you defeat me, I'm gonna go down kicking.
There you go.
And so, transitioning to tech, I was like, all right, we were getting off the ground. We had like a few customers. I had built this other company before. We had made money. And so I was like, oh yeah, like investors should invest in my company. Yeah, right. Like everything that they tell you is so true, right? When you go out and raise like those first dollars. And even though we had traction, even though we had a product in market, we were slowly like getting customers who were like, we don't really believe in that space, or we don't really think you have product market fit. We don't. It was always something, right? It was always but this. You show them something else, it was but that, right? It's like the closer you get to the goal, the finish line, they move finish line. Right. And so when we started having a breakthrough, it was really because I understood the foundation of like bootstrapping. And so I knew essentially, okay, how can we build a lean enough company early on to get more traction where we become undeniable? And so when we raised our Series A, it was kind of like, well, damn, they investing. Like, yeah, because look at our traction. Like we had all of the mechanics that would make it kind of crazy not to invest. But even with that, it was still hard to raise money. It was still like the diligence that we went through like months of diligence. And I knew in it and even come out of it that this is a BS. Like, this is some
Just
BS.
the whole thing's BS. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I do think that now, as we are like better positioned to like scale as a tech company, that we're just trying to like disrupt the space that we're in. And it's so different from bootstrapping. To your question, one big thing is that you're giving up part of your company, right? And so you're giving up equity in your company. And I'll tell you, probably the most stressful thing about running a venture-backed startup versus bootstrapping is investors.
They be
Sometimes I wake up and I'm like, did I make the right choice? Like,
we dreaming about, did I send that email back? My bad.
Yeah, it's kind of like, you know, I have a board meeting, my Q3 board meeting tomorrow. And, you know, it's like, oh, Sevetra, can you do, although our board meeting's on Thursday, can you do this quick presentation on Monday to the investment committee for one of my investors, right? So they're LPs, they're limited partners. Right. And so it's like, okay,
it's a lot.
You want me to do a presentation to your investors? Okay.
Right, you get a presentation.
I get they count on my investors, right. But I got a board meeting on Thursday. And so these are the type of things you got to deal with having investors, and the fact that, you know, you got to have quarterly meetings, you got to send reports, you know, they're going to probe you, ask you for all these questions. And it takes away time from you building your company. And so having to report to people, having to like, you know, you kind of have to get up. You kind of have to keep going because all these people have put so much money into you and invested in you, where it's like, all right, you got to keep pushing. Like, and so the L's feel a lot harder, in my opinion, when working in a startup where you're taking money.
And you're unique in the sense of you bootstrap the company, and then you also, like I said, raise venture capital as well. So like with those, you know, saying two different perspectives, like what would you, you know, saying give, you know, first-time founders who are, you know, thinking like, hey, like I want to go the venture route, or I don't know if I should just like, you know, just bootstrap, just grind it out for 5-6 years and like, you know, generate, you know, a lifestyle type of business. Like, what would you, you know, suggest or advise first-time founders?
Man, let me tell you, if lifestyle businesses were the way they were today, I don't know if I would have a tech startup. I don't know if I would have taken money. Right. Just because I've seen people be so successful. Like my friend Danielle Leslie, she had like courses from scratch, right? Oh, yeah. And she's probably done like 5 million so far this year. She's probably gonna do 10 million. I mean, it's possible that she does 10 million. My friend Jabril with Passport Heavy, they had their first $1 million month last month, right? And so I think that in the tech world or in the venture world, it's like, oh, lifestyle businesses, we would never fund those. But it's kind of like people really are out here building some pretty successful lifestyle businesses, and they don't have to report back to no investors. Right. You know, so I think that you have to think about like, what are you building and what do you need to get to where you ultimately want to go, right? And so for me, when I think about Resilia, I think that we have an opportunity to have a pretty substantial exit, right? And so I think that we kind of see who our players look like, what that potential exit could be like. And for me personally, I can't fathom how long it would take for me to bootstrap a company, right? To see those type of returns. Whereas I can build a company and potentially exit for $500 million, $300 million, $400 million within 5 to 10 years. Whereas could I have built that company bootstrapped, right? Yeah, and so you got to think about those things. And then also, if you're software, my professional services company, we weren't building software, and software is expensive.
It is.
And so you can't bootstrap all this stuff, right? Like some of this stuff is not bootstrappable, right? You need some cash in order to build some of these things.
When you get into the scalable technology, like you need to hire some dope people, and those dope people cost. The dope developers, they cost. But like you said, I always tell people that, you know, it's kind of 3 ways you can look at, you know, building a startup. It's like a lifestyle business where, you know, if you want to keep it going until the wheels fall off, or you want to, you know, build it up to get acquired or, you know, exit. Or number 3 is like go big, go home, try to go IPO, you know, which is, you know, a lot of our dreams, you know, they hit that IPO, but, you know, that's just about starting off with those goals. So that's awesome. So in regards to just uh finding that like that product market fit, with Resilia. I know you have to kind of switch it up in regards to like you mentioned like a subscription model and things of that sort. Like how did you know that like, hey, this is the product that we need to like double down on, and that this is an opportunity that nobody else is really capitalizing on?
Yeah, because so when we were thinking about our product, it was essentially because we were doing it as a service. So our first product in market, which was the formation product of incorporation exemption, we were offering that as a service, and it was so much paperwork. Like it was just like, this ain't even worth it. We gonna have to just phase the service out.
Right.
Regardless of the fact people keep coming to us for it. And then I thought about, well, what if we were able to like release some of the touches we were experiencing with this service? And that was really the foundation of what got me into the tech space with that product, was like, how do we productize this and make it easy to deliver, drastically reduce the cost to our customer, drastically reduce the cost that it takes in with people, and drastically increase the number of people we can serve across the entire country, right? And so that was my thought process when I was just thinking about like how to go about it and what was like the reasoning behind it. And then from there, although the products were an evolution of our previous services.
And trying to get into just like what I'm saying, just the momentum that you've gained just through PR. I know you've been in a lot of press, so just different articles, different news stations. So you type in your name, it's just like boom, like she's everywhere. So how have you gotten that PR? Number one, and then number two, like how have you leveraged the PR to like bring it back to closing deals and getting clients?
Yeah. So, people always ask me about like, oh, who do you use? I'm like, I don't use anybody. So it just came by way of building up my name. I really feel like in my city, right? And so I think you can start like in your city. You're doing things, you're meeting people, and people find out what you're doing. They're like, oh, that's really interesting. Like, we should cover you. We should do a story on you. And so my seed raise went viral 2 years ago, not because I sent out a press release anywhere. My friend Summer, who runs a blog, online blog in New Orleans that covers New Orleans entrepreneurs, she wrote an article about me like raising funding in Louisiana, and it got picked up, and then it kept getting picked up until it started going viral. And that happened via like a local newspaper. My first investor actually came out of Atlanta, and she was reading, is it Hippopotamus?
Hippopotamus. Yeah, I remember saw that article.
And so they did an article on me because they randomly found like something about me because they were looking for like Southeast founders and people building stuff. And they reached out to me via email, was like, hey, we'd love to do an article on you. And then my investor read the article, and that's how she got in touch with me. And she sent me a LinkedIn message. And so I think that it started very much like organically with me just like doing the work and people finding out about me. And now that we are like beginning to scale, we actually are thinking about a more structured approach to like, how do we use PR to engage our customers? And so it's like, where do our customers exist? Like, what do they read? Like, how can we be like thought leaders writing on those platforms, right? And positioning our product. And so when we think about like how we can like leverage those type of content PR channels, it's specifically about reaching our target audience and our target customers.
That's dope. So it sounds like so you had a lot of like early success, just from like building up the company, building up your first company, to a 7-figure business, to raising, 8 or I don't know, millions in regards to the startup world, but in regards to just like, within those 5 years of building that first company, or just like that transition to tech, like what about some of like some mistakes or some things that aren't talked about that aren't always glorified, that some founders like go through, like what could you share some of those things that you went through that you could like tell some of the first time founders like what can they avoid, or what can they learn from your experience?
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, some mistakes I made, right? spreading myself like too thin, right? Like trying to do everything and versus focusing on like one or two features that are just like dynamite versus, and instead of getting like a lot of mediocre stuff you can't even use and you got to start over, right? Team, so working with people that complement you and that are like serious about what you're building, so you got to hunt them down for stuff. Trying to stay, I mentioned this earlier, like staying like lean as possible, because early on, when particularly like when I was putting my own money into Resilia, I would, oh man, I wasted so much money, like just so much trial and error, like just wasting money. And so where you think you might need the money, you're like, oh man, I'm going to just make this happen. You probably don't need it. Like, it's like, what is like the minimum amount of power that you need to get going and to market, and how you can build momentum on that. And then continue to like build out your product. And so definitely trying to stay as lean as possible, as long as possible, and trying to like mitigate like costs as much as possible, which can definitely be hard for sure. But when I think about like some of the biggest mistakes I made, it had to do with like where we were spending money and just hiring the wrong people, starting off.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's good advice. So as far as, I have a couple more questions and I'll turn it over to some of the founders and what they have. But I would say, well, no, I'll leave that question. But in this current social climate, with just all this craziness going on that we talked about in the beginning, just like the economic downturn, like what would you, advise, like, I guess, for founders who are like, hey, I want to start a business during this time. I want to start a company during this time. Like what do you see, I guess, the landscape just from your perspective of, do you see any opportunities, any, anything like that? And then what would you, I guess, suggest to just people who are looking to start their company during this time?
Yeah, I mean, like two people, I think it was Jen, maybe Nikki. They were just basically some of the things they were talking about, right? I don't know how you all were like servicing your customers before, but being able to service people through a digital world, people are going to be looking at like how we do that and who can I get to do this for the people that I'm working with and who I'm serving and who I'm responsible for. How can I convene people? And so whereas your product can be like digitized and brought to people in that way, to people who generally did not utilize digitized products or technology, I think that there's a huge opportunity there. People are definitely thinking about like, oh, how do you do trainings online? Like, how do we do this? Like, we think about that with some like the foundations that we serve, where they're like, okay, we're not meeting in person, we're not doing no luncheons, we're not doing no breakfast meetups. Right. Like, how else can we serve people that we want to be successful? Trainings and things of that nature. And so Resilia was already building that inside of our subscription. But when you think about that across the landscape, I think that there's going to be a desire for that, and not one that's going to be like short term, but it's going to be like, yeah, we'll return one day back to events, but it doesn't mean we're going to stop doing the digital stuff either. It's going to be like a joint combination. I think that that's something that's going to last a long time. I do feel that when we think about like raising money, like my friend Dawn, a few others have been utilizing these, I guess they use Start Engine, but I've never seen the way people are raising money now, just like through crowdfunding. Like, we've never seen this before. I mean, I feel like we are like in the times of that now. And so I think that's an opportunity. People are like, oh, I just need like $100,000, $50,000. Like, how can I plan out a key campaign to get that capital if I need it to invest in my company? And let me tell you, those investors are a lot friendlier than these angel investors. The crowdfunding are a lot friendly. That's a lot more friendly money than individual investors that are knocking on your door, sending you emails and asking for X, Y, and Z. And so that's another opportunity, I think, that exists during these times where people are looking to support just like founders and minority founders across the board. And so, yeah, I think that is definitely an opportunity to be like real scrappy right now. And this is also the time of forgiveness, right? And so if something doesn't work, just bring it on COVID. Blame it on the times. People were like, oh, yeah, we understand. 2020 was hard for us all.
Right. You can blame it on a lot of things. So now is the time to do whatever you want to, and then just like, oh, yeah, it was COVID.
Yeah, man. The slate will be wiped clean for 2020. So if you win, you win, great. But, if you have a lot of bumps in the road,
Right.
all it will be forgiven.
Everybody's gonna be like, yeah, we understand. That's what the issue is.
Yeah, it's
But,
have mercy.
that's
Grace.
awesome. So, a couple more questions. I'll get into the chat, and y'all can drop some questions in the chat, and I'll ask them. So as far as just like what's next for Resilia, like, do you like you mentioned like exit? Are you looking to IPO? Like, what's the big vision for Resilia the next like 5 years that you see?
Yeah, I think that, so we're working on some pretty, as we would consider like transformational partnerships. And so obviously you can definitely grow through your own marketing channels and what you're doing internally. But what we want to kind of see over the next year, 2, 3 is like hyper growth. And so how can we get to our next milestone, which for us will be like 15 million in annual recurring revenue. And so we need to pull a few other triggers, and some of those triggers that we can pull would be like partnerships with like a LegalZoom for formation product, right? Partnerships with Microsoft or Oracle. And so we're definitely being very strategic about how do we like hyper grow the company through strategic partnerships, and how do we leverage like their brand, their lead engine power, their sales engine, their marketing engine, to benefit us and through a mutually beneficial opportunity. And as far as like IPO exit, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Yeah. I think that I don't think that we'll probably raise like potentially, unless a nice buyer comes along. Right. But we'll probably raise one more large round. So another Series B at some point over the next year or two. But I don't think we're never going to be, I never foresee myself like raising a Series D, E. Yeah. Because when you think about it, why, you can be that company if you want to go private or go public, if you want to IPO and all those things, that's great. But I don't know, I'm like a serial entrepreneur. And so I don't see myself building Resilia for another 30 years. But I do see us, us getting to a point where our product is living inside of a larger company, and it's existing to expand upon what we built it for. But yeah, I'm a big believer in ownership, and I just don't see myself diluting down to nothing and working it hard. So personal opinion.
My last question, and I'm gonna jump into the question for the founders. Impact, so you work with a lot of nonprofits that help out, push society forward, and then you just being a young Black woman who is killing it in the game, just in the tech world, just being a big representation, a big influence in the space. Like, where do you see just like in regards just to your impact thus far, and just like what legacy do you want to leave, just in general?
Yeah. So as far as leaving a legacy, I was having a conversation with my content writer about this. She was asking me this question earlier today. And I was basically saying that, like, how can we build transformative product that begins to collectively see impact happen over time and actually like move the needle, right? And so a lot of the work that we ultimately see happening is like, what's happening that things aren't getting better? So why is it taking so long for things to get better? And so I subscribe to a theory of like collective impact. It's because people are working in silos, because there's not enough force against issues at the same time that actually moves that issue forward, because people are being hoarders of money, and then when they do put money in places, they put it into like donor advised funds. Shout out to Mackenzie Scott for making $1.7 billion donations directly to the organizations. And not into large philanthropy that then takes 2, 5, 10, 20 years to give that $1.7 billion, right? And so those are the type of things that, I want to be a part of, and how I think our software can help advance that work and ensure that that money not only goes to good use, but that it ultimately moves things forward, that it ultimately creates more equitable practices, that it ultimately rises an entire generation out of poverty, that it ultimately closes the wealth gap between Brown and Black communities, that women are incrementally increase their wages. So these are the type of things that, our technology is being built to do, and to work alongside people that are committed to making that type of change.
Congrats, you made it to the midpoint of this episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Back to the Basics podcast. Before we get to the second half of this episode, we first want to give a big shout out to our awesome sponsors. So check them out.
How do you learn to hire better people, or how to hire better people?
Whoa, talking about, that was the one thing that I had to learn. I had to learn a lot. I'm still learning every day, but I got a lot better over time. So one thing is not to romanticize people. And so people can sell you on, they can sell you on your dream better than you can sell you're like, whoa, you saying all the great things, right? And so you kind of like start falling in love with candidates. And that's why separation is so hard too. From people where you're like, they should have been gone, but you're so close, you built that connection to them where you don't want to like separate. And so some ways I've done that is definitely by creating a hiring committee. And so whether or not those people are your early startup, there's probably not your team members. It's probably like your mentor, someone that you met in the corporate world, someone that trusts you and knows your product and knows, what you're trying to do, and let them interview those people too. And then also giving people a project, right? Like it's a basic project, right? And giving them like 72 hours to like turn it around. One is going to tell you if they're really serious about, working with you. And sticking to a deadline. Two is going to let you know, have they critically thought about what you're building, how they can be an asset to you. And so those are like two key things that I think have made like all the difference between hiring. Like I was going to hire like a growth marketer, and the project that he said, I was like, oh, absolutely not. Like this is not going to cut it, and it just revealed so much. And so definitely like those little small projects, doesn't have to take a lot, you're not trying to give nobody no thesis to write or anything like that, something really small, and give them freedom of how they actually put it together. And you can just reveal a lot about a candidate in those type of by doing those type of things. I hired a technical consultant. So when I first was building my tech company, I didn't go out and like find a CTO and like a co-founder that was technical. I was fortunate in that instance to be able to hire someone who was essentially like a hired gun, right? So sometimes what founders will do who are not technical, they'll try to go out and hire a software developer to build it. And so the only issue with that is that you don't know how to read the language, right? So you don't know how to read the code, so you can't hold them responsible. And so what I did was I hired a technical consultant who was like reporting to me. And then I hired or contracted a offshore engineer. And so sometimes founders will also try to go offshore and be non-technical and try to communicate with someone across an 8-hour, 9, 10, 12-hour gap. It's a recipe for disaster. But I did hire a technical consultant who worked with offshore developers. And so it allowed me to like save money by going offshore and having someone in the US who was non-technical, who understood what the person was doing, stayed on them, knew how to work the time zones, did the whole 9. And so I kind of got like a 2-for-1 deal because I wasn't paying US prices for a software engineer.
That's dope. That's really good. That's really good. Okay, cool. Next question is Jen. She says, okay, I think we probably answered that one. I'll say, how do you know when it was time to switch over from bootstrapping to raising funds? What was the tipping point?
Yeah, so for me, it was because we started building software, and like I kind of mentioned a little bit, but it's costly to like build software, and sometimes you have to have like a prototype before you get market, before you could sell. And when I was bootstrapping, we actually had professional service, so we could actually sell our service, get paid, and the cost, we were the cost, right? So the cost being in people. And so you could barter with people too, right? And so you have someone that does X, Y, and Z, not so much with software, right? Unless you're bringing someone on as like a co-founder or something of that nature, but eventually you're going to need more people to build out your product. And so that's like one of the biggest things, like when you have to either purchase a lot. So say if you are selling something and you have to like purchase something in quantity, you don't have the money to do that. Like a friend of mine, she owns a boutique. And I was like, you should get some investors, right? If the bank won't give you a loan. You probably want to get some investors because you're never going to turn a profit because you don't have enough to sell. You don't have enough inventory. Mm-hmm. And so you can't afford to buy the inventory. Mm-hmm. And so something got to give, right? Mm-hmm. Something got to give. And then here's the other thing. It's just harder to build anything when you don't have any money, right? When you're thinking about paying bills. And so most investors will be, I think there's like been this hype around like, oh yeah, you should be like living dirt poor, you should be struggling. People talk all that game, but
right.
As an investor myself, I don't want the family I invested in thinking about how they go and scrape coins to like, buy food or like stuff like that. Like that don't entice me to believe that you're going to be focused on building this company. So I'd rather
you'll be hungry, man.
Right. And I'd rather you be okay. I mean, don't break the bank, right? But pay yourself something so you're not like struggling. And I think most investors, at least the ones you want, will believe that.
Right.
And one other thing to know about like paying yourself. So one thing they don't tell you in tech, but
gems, please give us the gem.
Is to at some point when you raise enough money, you could take money off the top, right? And so
break this down.
It was kind of frowned upon a long time ago, but not anymore. Everybody does it. But so say you're raising like a Series A or Series B, and you raise like $10 million or $20 million. In that $20 million, you're still going to have X amount of equity in the company. And so you can say, look, I'm working hard for 10 years or 5 years or whatever. I'm going to sell off some of my equity. And so you might say, I'm going to sell $2 million worth of equity, and you can cash out in that round. And so you will be essentially taking $2 million out of that $20 million round for yourself. And so sometimes this capital game is literally
it's a game.
A game.
So wait. So essentially, like you said, taking some off the top.
And that's your money. If the company busts, no matter what the company do, like that's an investment.
In your pocket real quick. So essentially,
not real quick because you got to build a company to raise money now. But it's another way to actually do that.
So in regards to like selling it, you're saying just selling it to like back to the investor, saying like, hey, I'll take this share, but I'll sell out, or I'll sell a couple of my, percentages to those.
Yeah, and so some founders do this. So someone said, does that mess up your dilution in the future? It depends on how much equity you have, right? And so obviously if you got 2% equity in your company, you probably don't want to give up another percentage, but that means you didn't probably raise so much money or were in some upside down term sheet. But I think that once people start getting to like Series Bs and higher, 9 times out of 10 founders are taking money out on top. And so the reason why they do that is, one, the investors, they want you to be motivated to continue to work, right? And so the way they motivate you is to give you a little cash. And that could be like, oh, you might want to buy a house. You might want to, live a better life now that that you work for so many years.
Right.
That you've been on the struggle bus for so many years, right?
At least, yeah.
Yeah, and so they incentivize founders by usually starting like in Series B and thereafter by allowing them to sell off some of their shares. Now, that's one thing you have to be noticeable about in your term sheet is because some investors, like these old school term sheets, they're like, oh, well, you can't sell off your shares, right? Don't get locked up in that type of term sheet. They'll say you can't sell off for at least 4 years. Or they'll say you have to vest your shares first. And so depending on how long you have been running your company before you raise money, will probably determine that. And so when I raised my Series A, the investor tried to pull that on. I was like, absolutely not. We won't take your money. That's a deal breaker.
Because you
I'm
have
already vested.
Yeah.
I want to take money off the top. Whereas another investor was like, hey, you want to sell some of your shares to me? Right? I was like, no, we're not.
Now we get that'd be a fine line between that two.
But another thing I did was my company SGI, I invested personally money. But when I got tired of investing my own money, I gave SGI a loan to Resilia. And so Resilia, like on our balance sheet, we have like, oh, Resilia has a loan out from SGI, right, for X amount of money. And now that we raised a Series A, we raised enough money, Resilia is about starting paying back that loan to SGI, which is my company that I own 100% of. Right. And so these are like the tricks of the trade that people don't like. I feel like we don't be knowing this stuff. But
how is it, building a company just from the South? What kind of like pushback have you gotten from this investor?
Yeah, it was hard. It was definitely hard. We had investors like, oh, you need to move to Atlanta. If you're going to be in the South, at least be in Austin or Atlanta.
Right.
And then we decided that we were going to stay in New Orleans. Before COVID, we were actually about to open an office in Atlanta, a third office. But COVID hit and it didn't make any sense. So we just stayed in New Orleans and New York. But recruiting is so hard in New Orleans. And so that's one advantage that Atlanta had, is that at least we'd be able to recruit talent. But recruiting is hard in New Orleans primarily because people are comfortable in the positions that they're in and the tech companies that they're at. And so we're starting to just see like the movement from tech company to tech company, which is how the ecosystem builds, right? And so that person goes work for Google, then they say, all right, tired of corporate, then I can go work for a startup, teach them everything that I knew. Or I worked for this startup that grew to $100 million. Now I'm gonna come back in and work for early stage startup and bring my knowledge. And so when you don't have that type of funnel in your community, it's hard. And that's why I had so many issues like hiring people in New Orleans, which is also the reason why we opened the second office in New York, to bring some of those resources back to New Orleans, but still committing to building a company in New Orleans and in the South.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Back to the Basics, powered by Thrive. Be sure to subscribe, follow, and share this show with your fellow first-time founders. You can find this episode along with resources and tools discussed at squareoneschool.com/content. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode of Back to the Basics.